Da fangen wir mal an. 5 o'clock. Welcome everybody, colleagues, students here in Spui 25 and at home everybody in the live stream. My name is Krijn Thijs, I'm a historian, and this is one of our traditional Amsterdam German Studies lectures, an event organized by the Duitsland Institute Amsterdam. In this lecture series, we regularly invite German scholars and from beyond to present their youngest research on topics in modern German and European matters, history and various other disciplines, and to discuss their work in Amsterdam with professional as well as public audiences. So let me introduce today, in a few words, the guest of today and the topic. Our guest is Thomas Mergel from Humboldt University in Berlin, professor for Europäische Geschichte des 20. Jahrhunderts, and I might say one of Germany's leading historians of the last 2-3 decades. He has been a guest in Amsterdam before, about 10 years ago. He spoke on Politiker in der Badehose a couple of years ago, also politicians in swimming pants. Also on the almost classical topic of the body of the ruler in various forms of political representation, a topic truly representative of Mergel's academic oeuvre. Thomas Mergel was educated in Bielefeld in the 1980s, also at the high temple of social history, Geschichte als historische Sozialwissenschaft. And he then belonged to the generation of historians who reintroduced elements of cultural history into those vast historical landscapes of structures, classes, progress, regional explanation, and the macro continuities of modern German historiography. Together with colleagues such as Sebastian Conrad, Ute Frevert, Ute Daniel, the late Thomas Welskop, Christoph Conrad, and others, he provoked a broad and fierce theory discussion with some of the dogmatiker of social history concerning the question of new cultural history, which rather was new in Germany, adopted from earlier waves in France or America. About the subjective experiences, about the body, about narratives and representation, about language and discourse, in short, about questions of priority to culture or society, zwischen Kultur und Gesellschaft. Inspiring a whole range of younger scholars and students at that time, as I myself can affirm in my own training in Berlin in those days. And Thomas Mergel himself worked on topics in the field of Catholicism in the Kaiserreich for its PhD, and then on questions of traditional political history, parliaments, for example, as in his Habil, or second book, on questions of political culture, political communication, and the public sphere in the Reichstag during the Weimar Republic. And I also want to mention his influential lecture Überlegungen zu einer Kulturgeschichte der Politik in 2002, opening new waves of approaching cultural framing of politics in history, path-breaking for a lot of projects also beyond Germany, also in the Netherlands, among others. But all that is long ago, and since those foundational years, Thomas Mergel has worked at a range of German and international universities, too much to list here, ranging from Prague to Basel, Potsdam, Chicago, until he landed in Berlin at the Humboldt University in 2008, as we say so. And he wrote an impressive list of further publications. I only mention some of them, a monography on the history of Great Britain after 1945, and a history of Wahlkämpfe, campaigning in the West German Bundesrepublik after 1945, under the title Propaganda After Hitler, between Hitler and Americanism, political campaigning in West Germany, and just recently an introduction to the history of the state in modern Europe, on which he will teach a masterclass tomorrow with history students at the University of Amsterdam. Today, Thomas Mergel will take up the history of the Weimar Republic again, and it's no coincidence that Weimar history today is center stage in many public as well as professional discussion on European history. The turbulences, on the one hand, mainly in Germany, the current shape of democracies, and the worries about our parliamentary systems. We speak, as today, about the Reichsbürger again. We've seen the news probably. It leads back to earlier and dark experiences in Germany's first democracy that collapsed, as we all know, in 1933. Are we nearing a Weimar situation again? Questions like these are debated not just in German newspapers and talk shows, also here. And also with regard to authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe or the erosion of democracy in American Trumpism. For these reasons of public debate and present politics, Weimar topics are up and coming for a long time. On the other hand, we also have various professional lines of work leading to re-investigate Weimar history and to free the Republic of the burden of its failure as a democracy in 1933, as Hitler came to power. We also have our own representatives of this debate among colleagues in the Netherlands. For example, with the diverging interpretations of Patrick Dassen, the historian working in Leiden, arguing for the openness of Weimar history in his latest new book, Libris Nominated. And on the other hand, our own emeritus UvA professor Frits Boterman, always claiming the need to explain 1933 from within the history of the Weimar Republic. Stuck in these diachronical, alas, vertical perspectives, tying Weimar into lines of temporal development, one way of breaking down, of breaking through the confines of this classical debate might be to tie synchronic, alas, horizontal connections and contexts to Weimar history. Also to transgress the borders of the nation and to open historical theaters for broader European, perhaps also global views on democratic histories. Navigating on the title today, I would expect Thomas Mergel to go in this direction, but we will see. One last word to the program. After the lecture of Thomas Mergel, I have invited my colleague my colleague Moritz Vilmer, universitair hoofddocent at the UvA in the history department, an expert on Weimar and Nazi history, among other things, to deliver a first commentary to the discussion and open the debate on the lecture. So we will have a short dialogue on the panel before then opening into the audience for questions and remarks on the lecture of Thomas Mergel. So now, Mr. Mergel, dear Thomas, I hand over to you. Floor is yours. Thank you for coming over.
Yes, there you go. I just forgot my pen. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for this very nice introduction. It makes me a little ashamed. I was introduced as a cultural historian, which I am. And the question always is, what is cultural history and what not? I will talk about Weimar today, one of the still big enigmas of German history. Part of this is to ask for the interpretive foils, for the interpretive frames that exist when we try to understand Weimar. Krein talked about this discussion which has been going on in Germany as well, that says Weimar has to be not interpreted teleologically from 1933 back, but as an open experience, as an open experiment too, which is the case. But I would today focus on another point, that the history of Weimar, which has for long been interpreted as a failure, as a fateful failure, a failure from the outset, that this explanation goes back to the comparative measure it has, because the measure for this devastating judgment was always Western democracy. Compared to Britain, France, or the US, Weimar was regarded, in fact, as an exception. Even though it was, that's what the older explanation and the disappointment with Weimar was. So Weimar was economically and culturally as advanced as its Western neighbors. Germany was obviously not able to establish political modernity, and that is a stable liberal democracy. This is what the theory of the German Sonderweg, of the special path of Germany, essentially says. that Weimar, although advanced in many respects, was not able to develop a stable liberal democracy. But was Weimar as Western as presumed here? That's my question today. This theory of the special path of Germany into the 20th century is out of date for long. Yet still there is this core idea that is alive up to now, and that is sort of part of this discussion on the open history of Weimar that Krein mentioned. And the idea is political modernity is just another word for liberal Western democracy. This was the normal path, liberal democracy. This view was, as today, I would say, is much more visible, strongly impregnated by the Cold War. It was a Cold War message that the good democracy is liberal Western democracy, and consequently, this idea has gone a certain reassessment in the last decades. Attempts have been made to historicize mentalities as well as political and social concepts with the intention to look onto Weimar less through this normative lens of the Cold War, to normalize Weimar, as was the word. But the overall picture remained strangely unimpressed. And the picture said the Republic struggled with its own history and its inability to politically compromise. It did not come to terms with the past and did not learn to cope with the defeat of war and its consequences. It was overrun by the momentum of economic crisis and egoistic interest groups, and so on. You all know this. However, one could ask, well, what would you expect? All these features are shaped by the expectation that the Weimar Republic should have been more like the West, and this very quickly, after a devastating defeat. And one could continue to ask, what about the others? What about the many newly founded states in Central and Southeastern Europe? How did they come to terms with their twisted histories and with themselves? And even more, how much did the Weimarers not only look at Britain and France, but also at their neighbors in the East? Were there commonalities? What did they learn from one another or not? In what way was Weimar an exception? How German was what happened there? Of course, the West as a role model, this was convincing already for contemporaries because, after all, it was the West which had won the war, and the vanquished should learn from the victor, as we all know. This was especially true for the big question of democracy, since it was not simply the West, but rather the Western democracies which had won. And so it seemed obvious that the losers, all of them monarchies, had to learn the lesson. Within the German Empire, the former Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, the Tsarist Empire, the former Tsarist Empire, and last but not least, what had been the Ottoman Empire, everywhere the question of democracy was at stake in whatever way. However, what democracy and republic actually meant was less clear. In fact, it was highly controversial in the interwar period, since it was by no way clear that the British or the French were applicable all over the place. My intention today is therefore to broaden the view and to qualify the normative Western bias by sharpening the lens towards the East and the Southeast of Europe. Starting from the question of common European problems after 1918 and with a focus on economy, politics and mentalities, I will try to develop a view that sees the Weimar Republic less as a Western country than rather more inclined towards the East, claiming in the end a middle position between both sides. My first point is common problems. Germany is the most Western country of the region, which the right-wing publicist Giselher Wirsing in 1932 called Zwischeneuropa, Inter-Europe. Not to be confused with Mitteleuropa, Central Europe, Zwischeneuropa. An area where the war could not be finished by 1918, an endless succession of revolutions and civil wars endured country and people. This was warland for decades. In Western Europe, on the other hand, where the victors of the Great War were at home, there was no such thing as fundamental regime changes, no paramilitary desperado armies fighting with gruesome brutality. When there is talk of a second 30 Years' War, or of a European civil war, then this Zwischeneuropa is in focus. War continued in Germany too. Revolution counter-revolution, Bolshevik assaults, the Freikorps, the assassination of politicians, they all show the Eastern European warland extended all the way to the Rhine. This experience was very different from Western Europe, and it prepared for further developments deviating from the West. One could assess these conflicts as the birth pains of new states, some of which, like Poland or Czechoslovakia, emerged from scratch, others suddenly having a completely different outlook, such as Hungary, which lost 2/3 of its historical territory. Others, like Germany, became new forms of state. Various new political systems were tried. All of them focuses on the problem of integration, since all countries saw themselves as nation states, although none of them was. With the sole exception of Germany, vielleicht. The successor states to the multi-ethnic empires of Russia, Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire were themselves multi-ethnic, and this put an enormous strain on the legitimacy of the new polity, since minorities were disadvantaged almost everywhere. Almost all of these nations not only had minorities in their own country, but also co-nationals in other countries. And this was especially true of Germany. Unlike the Kaiserreich, the Weimar Republic now was a largely homogeneous nation-state, largely. For the first time, so, but at the price of relevant German minorities in all Eastern and Southeastern European countries. These Auslandsdeutsche were estimated at about 18 million in 1939. This irredenta represented a permanent disruptive factor in their respective countries, just as it functioned as a permanent instance of appeal for inner German political conflicts. And the Auslandsdeutschen attracted the attention of the Germans and pulled their view towards the East. The Auslandsdeutschen were the subject of fierce international conflicts, and most of them were not full-fledged Western Democrats, to say the least. The economic crisis was a common feature of these regions as well. The war had increased national debt to astronomical heights throughout Europe, hitting largely the own people. To get rid of debts, inflation was a useful yet dangerous option. But that was not the only factor for inflation. Military spending was high because of the many conflicts pending. Reparations also engendered inflationary tendencies. Inflation was, as we know, by far most cataclysmic in Germany for obvious reasons, but it was ubiquitous. Austria, for example, also experienced hyperinflation, which caused the currency to collapse in 1925. The result of inflation, and this is my point, was the complete destruction of the middle-class savings. Therefore, the interwar period faced a profound crisis of the bourgeois middle classes. This was especially true in Germany and former Austria-Hungary. In Russia, the bourgeoisie was eliminated by other techniques, as we all know. These inflationary tendencies also existed in Western Europe, but they were far less disastrous, not least because these countries, like the USA, were not afraid to devalue their currencies, which dampened inflation and relieved the middle classes over time. Without stretching the argument too far, I would say the crisis of bourgeoisie and the middle classes at all was particularly pronounced in the area from Germany eastward. The farm crisis, to name another point of crisis that began in the early 1920s and reached global dimensions, was primarily a result of the expansion of agriculture's capacities in the US during the war. In Eastern Europe, a large part of the population was employed in the farming sector. Yet a high proportion of the land was in the hands of a few big owners. In most of these countries, land reforms were carried out after 1918, with up to 40% of the farmland being redistributed. Yet this was not enacted only for the purpose of social justice, but also out of the hope to break away from industrial society and to reintroduce a small-scale farming economy. However, most of these small farms could not compete with industrialized American agriculture. Because there were basically new national societies, Zwischen-Europa was a zone of experiments in every respect. In particular, the political system, its legitimacy and procedures were testing grounds, and from today's perspective, we should not underestimate the contemporaries' open-mindedness vis-à-vis these experiments. For example, there were the Soviet-style council dictatorship in Hungary, 1819, and the Bolshevik party dictatorship in Russia. There were fascist and semi-fascist systems, mass-based as in Italy or elite-based as in Austria. There were charismatic and authoritarian semi- and quasi-democracies as in Poland or in the Yugoslav kingdom. And there were parliamentary democracies as in Czechoslovakia or in Germany. The range was wide. These experiments and this range did not take place in the West. Of course, debates about political reform, especially about the integration of the working class, took place in Britain and France too. Here, however, the political system remained largely unquestioned, and Labour parties came to government for the first time. The extension of democracy, as it developed slowly in both countries, did not destabilize the system. This was also the case in the USA, where the social and economic crisis had led to a Keynesian interventionist state in the 1930s. But the system in the USA was not called into question. In contrast to these countries, in Central and Eastern Europe, every opposition was system opposition from the outset. With every change of power, a regime change was immediately imminent. This constant system threat led to the search for a certain political stability, mostly through the recourse to authoritarian leadership structures. In Western Europe, in contrast, a type of conservative democracy developed, which was aptly called Tory democracy. Tory democracy described a conservatism that is part of the system and does not want to overthrow it. This kind of conservatism was completely unknown to Central Europe. My second point concerns the economy. For the interwar period, the theory of deglobalization is popular, and in many respects rightly so. It is argued that after the First World War, the first globalization wave of the late 19th century was succeeded by a new protectionism. International exchange was reduced, high tariff barriers favored national and in some cases even international cartels, which led to quasi-monopolistic structures at the expense of consumers. However, for Germany, this was not true in every respect. The German economy realized that it needed rapid reintegration into the world economy, and this took its time. The Versailles Treaty hindered German companies to re-enter their pre-war markets. With the Dawes Plan of 1924, however, the disadvantage for the German economy expired, and moreover, the US economy became heavily involved in Germany, and other areas were now open to trade again, such as South America. Germany's largest trading partner in the 1920s were the USA, ahead of Great Britain, the Netherlands, and France. By the end of the 1920s, many people do not know this, the German economy had recovered so much that industrial and raw material exports had reached pre-war levels again. German manufacturers' exports had a world market share of almost a quarter, just as before the First World War, and this was far more than France, Great Britain, and the USA. Germany was, you could say, the leading export nation of the world around 1930. Cooperation with the victors was difficult, above all with the French. The coal and iron regions in West Germany, Benelux, and France, which had flourished before 1914, were only slowly restituted. Yet in 1926, the International Raw Steel Community was founded. The Raw Steel Community was an international cartel with the participation of the French, the German, the Saarland, the Belgian and the Luxembourg steel industry, which mainly had the British and American competition on its radar. Post-1945 West European integration started here, with coal and steel. Although a pilot function for European unification is questioned by research, I would state that these experiments with international cooperation in the steel and coal had a formative function for the time to come. So, to conclude this, in sheer numbers, Germany belonged economically more to the West. Despite this factual orientation, German industry yet looked closely to the East and Southeast as a space of the future. There was the newly formed Soviet Union, which was in urgent need of reconstruction aid. Political antagonisms were less important compared to the fact that both countries, Russia and Germany, had lost the war. Moscow's systematic destabilization policy towards Germany with attempted insurrections of the German Communist Party in the early 20s did not harm cooperations. Part of the Rapallo Treaty of 1922 between Germany and Russia was the strengthening of economic relations. It was about timber cutting licenses, infrastructure endeavors, and above all, agrarian concessions. Of all Western countries, Germany was the most active in opening up this new market, which flourished until the beginning of the Great Terror. Despite the difficult economic environment, the Siemens company, which had been involved in Russia from an early stage, continued to do business with the new rulers, supported by personal contacts and old relationships. The business was not skyrocketing during the 1920s. The volume was usually less than 2% of Siemens' total business, although during the Great Depression the share tripled. However, more important than the sheer numbers were the expectations. Capitalist German companies saw a promising market in socialist Russia. The minor role of political antagonisms can be seen clearly in the secret military cooperation between Germany and Russia that began as early as 1920 with the Social Democrats in power. It was a win-win deal. The Soviet Empire needed modern military technology. The army of the German Reich, for its part, was limited by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men. Building a new army in secret was its agenda. Through front companies and with considerable financial support by the German government, a joint aircraft and weapons production was set up in Russia, pilots were trained and weapons tested. Despite the German turn to the West under Gustav Stresemann, which led to the Treaty of Locarno, despite Germany joining the League of Nations in 1925, secret cooperation between the Reichswehr and the Red Army continued until 1932. And this regardless of the fact that the cooperation was not so secret since 1926 anymore. The SPD politician Philipp Scheidemann brought the matter to the light of day, and the scandal was discussed in the French and British public as well. But only when the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with France and Poland in 1932, and the German Reich regained its military autonomy in the same year, the cooperation between Russia and Germany discontinued. So, not because it was a scandal, but because it was no longer necessary. The Soviet Union was of particular interest to German and non-German economists because it practiced a new and experimental system of economic planning. As a fruit of the war economy, it seemed obvious to experts like Walter Rathenau and Max Weber that unregulated capitalism had no future and that socialism in some form was inevitable. But the testing ground of how this planned economy could function was the young Soviet Union. Today, we tend to underestimate how exciting the Soviet experiments were for the Western economists, and no way only for observers from the left. Liberal economists, too, sought to take lessons from the great experiment, and there were grand travels of groups of economists, be it liberal or not, or socialist or not, to the Soviet Union to observe these new experiments. Arguments such as efficiency and distribution, exploration of new resources, or the development of empty regions thrilled many from left to right, be it with criticism or with admiration. Of particular interest was the role of the industrial working masses. One could even say that in terms of the use of the workforce, The Soviet Union offered a vision comparable to the 40s standardization of production modes in America. In both places, the mass society of the future was at display. Apart from Russia, the German entrepreneurs and economists had a close look to the former imperial areas in Southeast Europe. Mitteleuropa had been conceived as a space of influence already before the war, and Mitteleuropa extended far into the east. Now that the Habsburg power was no longer in existence, now that the newly emerged Turkish Republic had to take care of its own, and Russia was fighting for survival, now the region of Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Greece seemed all the more to be a quasi-colonial space for the Germans, an informal German empire by the way of economic hegemony. The region could serve as a substitute for the lost globalized economy. The economic backwardness of southeastern Europe offered an opportunity to develop this region. On the other hand, it could supply cheap agricultural products and oil. Germany was the largest trading partner of Yugoslavia, Romania and Bulgaria in the 1920s, and this was even increased after 1933. In economic terms and beyond, South German Europe was largely dependent on Germany, object to a quasi-colonial gaze. My third point concerns political orders and political mentalities. The First World War had fundamentally changed the balance of power that had been working since the Vienna Congress. The pentarchy of 1815 had now become a triarchy, at least for the time being, because Russia, Germany and Habsburg were out of the game for now. Instead, the USA had stepped in, and this meant the European great powers, Britain, France and the USA, were all Western powers. The east and southeast of Europe had sunken to areas of influence and to problem zones. And even if France might figure as a protector of the new nations, there were limits to its ambitions. France's main interest was to curb Germany's foreseeable growing influence. The newly founded states, for their part, had to balance their international relations and were interested in good relations to Germany, not least because they looked anxiously upon Russia. German relations were most difficult with Poland, because this new state had been founded at Germany's massive expense and thus depended on a close relation with France, but had also a strong drive to expand. Poland wanted to become a regional great power. Since German policy towards Poland was revisionist all the way, regardless of which political party was in charge, the relationship status thus was complicated. A similar complicatedness applied to Czechoslovakia. Also, the more moderate Czech foreign policy resulted in more peaceful everyday relations. Thus, from an East Central European point of view, Germany was not a beloved, but perhaps a needed partner with whom one had to come to terms, and this all the more because there was the big bear in the East. Relations with the new Republic of Austria were much closer, much closer. A political union with Germany was desired by a majority in both countries and, nota bene, especially by the Social Democrats. This Großdeutschland had been a dream of the democratic left since the revolution of 1848. But the dream was blocked by the Allies from the outset, for good reasons so. For it was a real nightmare for the French that it could be precisely the lost World War that would create an ethnically homogeneous Großdeutschland. However, whether good or bad relations, many of these Zwischen-Europa states resembled each other in terms of their political systems, and the Weimar Republic was not far off. Of course, in 1918, democracy seemed to be the only possible form of government in the entire region. But which democracy? In Germany, there had been a lively discussion among political theorists during the war about what form the new democracy should take. Obviously, they first gazed to the West, but they didn't cherish these models too much. Rather, there was a skeptical rejection of Western democracy, as it was called in Germany. However, these Western democracies might differ among themselves a lot. Above all, French, as it was called, parliamentary absolutism was rejected because too much, today we would say, populism seemed to be built in France. But most German experts were also aware of the weaknesses of the British system. In any case, the British single constituency franchise did not seem suitable for Germany, where almost nobody doubted the necessity of a proportional representation, a proportional franchise. The idea of a German House of Lords, just imagine, seemed equally weird. There were similar problems with the US model, the checks and balances of which did not seem to fit Germany. All in all, the Western examples were seen only with great reluctance and always with the attitude that these were Sonderwege, special paths, and therefore not easily transferable. The Weimar Constitution instead constructed a model of dual sovereignty that at first glance resembled the USA but was very different at crucial points. The Reichspräsident on the one hand, the Reichstag on the other hand, were both equal expressions of the sovereignty of the people and therefore, unlike in the USA, both directly elected. Clever observers immediately asked, what would then happen if the Reichstag and the Reichspräsident were at odds and did disagree? Was such a sovereign who disagreed with himself even conceivable? As is well known, this very German construction came to a bad end. However, it contained a feature introduced in most East Central and Southeastern European systems sooner or later by law or by force, and that is, the parliament was for the good times. In times of crisis, the authoritarian element embodied in the Reichspräsident was called upon. This, so to speak, authoritarian reassurance prevailed over time in most countries over parliament. Where the construction of this ultimate authority was lacking, it was introduced by way of coup, as in Poland in 1926, or as the granting of authoritarian power by the elites, as in the Southeast European royal dictatorships in Czechoslovakia or in Italy. In Czechoslovakia, authoritarian rule made its way informally. The Czech political system started with a very strong and celebrated emphasis on parliamentary decision-making. But very soon, the decisive party leaders established an informal system of pre-decision-making, bypassing parliament. On the other hand, the state co-founder and longtime president Thomas Mergel interpreted the presidency as the epitome, the embodiment of the state. In his conception, opposition to him, as the state, was system opposition. Masaryk, who as early as 1919 had considered a temporary dictatorship, represented an authoritarian idea of democracy. This is a point which rarely pops up in the positive narratives of Czechoslovakia, which is said to have been the only proper parliamentary democracy in East Central Europe. A personality cult around Masaryk stressed his humble origins and his identity with the people, a democratic Führerkult, one could say. Germans looked with interest to Czechoslovakia and to Poland, where Piłsudski relied on a different but similar legend of the people's leader. So this leader question, this leader solution was by no means unique to Germany. And this is important, these authoritarian tendencies did not simply imply an abolition of the democratic idea. Rather more, the vast majority of these constructions relied on the concept of the sovereign people as the basis of political legitimacy still. Thomas Masaryk thus identified authoritarian rule explicitly with reference to the people. And I quote, "A dictatorship disempowers parliament, but it enables the rule of the people. Thus, it makes democracy possible." Quote end. Dictatorship, properly understood, was democracy. The German political theorist Carl Schmitt expressed a theoretical argument which can be put as the core idea of authoritarian democracy when he said, if the voters, elected 500 representatives who would constantly disagree and argue, then it would be equally legitimate to elect, say, only one person as the representative of the whole people. Hereby, the homogeneity of the citizens' community would be even more confirmed, because one person could embody the will of the one constitutional people much more authentically, if only because he would not constantly be at odds with himself. In contrast to the Western European construction and to the American solution alike, the Central and Eastern European democracies, including Germany, had an underlying authoritarian momentum, which, however, emphatically understood itself as an actual realization of the democratic idea, yet based on authority and order. And this leads to, as I think, the most fundamental distinction between the Eastern and the Western political discourses. In Zwischeneuropa, the notion of pluralism as the basis of a political society was controversial and sometimes fiercely contested. Instead, homogeneity should lay ground for a good society. An authoritarian leader stood for this homogeneous people. The dialectic of government and opposition, which had emerged in Britain since the 17th century and is part and parcel of today's idea of democracy, smelled bad because political difference was considered a threat to the unity of the people. Homogeneity instead of pluralism. This was the utopian horizon against which political debates in Central and Eastern Europe took place. In Germany, this longing for a people of similars became visible in the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, which was highly uncontroversial far into the left and was, until the early 1930s, also used far more broadly than simply in the racist context we all know well. Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, had many meanings, and it was precisely because of the many meanings that the term couldn't be used by the many. After all, we are in Luther's country, where disunity was a self-descriptive coin since the Reformation. So, when Catholics said Volksgemeinschaft, they dreamed of overcoming confessional division. Employers had the pacification of class struggle in mind. Social politicians wanted to announce an all-embracing welfare state when saying Volksgemeinschaft. East and West Germany were supposed to merge when people said Volksgemeinschaft, and Nazis meant the exclusion of Jews. The longing for homogeneity formulated in the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft was accompanied by a disgust for political parties because parties were seen as an expression of conflicting, that is, divisive interests. A much discussed catchphrase of the late 1920s was partyism, in German Parteiismus. Ismus is always kind of an ideology, which meant the division of the German people into opposing selfish groups and the ideology that this should be a good thing. This longing for similarity and togetherness, which lay behind such discourses, distinguished German political thought from Western models. But those ideas were close to the East because the new nations had to put integration on top of their agenda. The appeal to national unity, the invention of historical legacies, the suppression of national minorities, but also authoritarian democracy were used as tools of welding the people together. My fourth and last point is on mentalities, fascinations, anxieties, aesthetics. All these uncertainties notwithstanding, the time of the First World War was the period of a high modernism that was most future-proof and most interested in the future. As Rüdiger Graf has shown for the Weimar Republic, it was precisely the experience of crisis that made for an open future, because in crisis, new paths can open up. In East and West, with the USA and Soviet Russia, there were two examples for very open futures. Very different at first glance, though. Both were highly ambiguous, subject of fears, as well as of euphoric hopes. The USA, as a space of imaginations and real experiences alike, already played an important role in the 19th century, spurred on by mass migration to the New World. After 1918, the new international role and the obvious success of the American social model made it a pattern for Europe and far beyond. And the Europeans came to the country in real, too. Lured by cheap money, they flocked to Germany, especially during the inflation period, and with them came the dollar, a fetish object very soon. With the flocking in of Americans, social and cultural imaginations also poured in. Technical modernity, with mass-manufactured products, from film to the telephone to the car, spurred the vision of a mass consumer society, which in Europe was only a vague glimpse until after 1945. In the United States, however, consumer society seemed already to be there. Aesthetic modernism, particularly evident in urban planning, also was driven by much certainty about the future. A cultural modernism, as can be seen in self-dependent, short-haired young women, avant-garde film or black jazz musicians, made many in Germany feel uneasy about American modernism, though. People also came to Germany from the East. However, they were not lured by the cheap money of inflation, but driven out by the Bolshevik Revolution. Hundreds of thousands of Russians poured into Germany from 1917 onwards, especially to Berlin. All older supporters of the Tsarist regimes. The district of Charlottenburg was for years commonly known as Charlottengrad. These Russians were aristocratic and bourgeois immigrants, and they created a refugee Russia, which on the one hand suffered from a massive social decline, but on the other hand also stuck to nostalgia, a melancholic and mystical Russia. And apart from the refugees, there were others who had come from the East and could represent otherness only too well. The Eastern Jews, who had been immigrating to Germany already since the late 19th century, but in massive numbers now in the wake of the First World War. Their way of life, their habit, language, and apparent unwillingness to assimilate charged everyday anti-Semitism with a sense of cultural superiority on the side of the Germans. These rich Americans, as well as the socially relegate and depressed Russian refugees, and even more so the Eastern Jews, all made for a similar feeling. We, the Germans, are different, and we are somehow superior, too. Admittedly, this real experience of the other was an experience of the big cities, above all of Berlin. But the mass media transported such images to the provinces so that in, say, Bückeburg or Ancum, people knew quite well about who the Americans and who the Eastern Jews were and what was different about them, even if they never had met any of that kind. Ambivalence, too, when looking towards the East. Okay, the Soviet Union was the fruit of gruesome and unabashed revolutionaries, right. But on the other hand, it claimed to be the incarnation of a radically new future. It pledged not only justice for the poor and enough food and housing for everyone, it also stood for a new lifestyle. And just like the United States, it shaped an aesthetic modernism that began as avant-garde, but promised to become mass experience in the short future. Films like Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin created a cult of Russia, especially among intellectuals. The Soviet urban developments drew German architects to Russia en masse to work on a new proletarian everyday culture. Intellectuals and other tourists flocked to Russia to study the new society, and even if they did not see all too much, because a large part of them hardly got out of Moscow, the 100 or so travel reports published in Germany made readers curious about the country. I have already mentioned the economists who pilgrimaged to Russia in order to learn about the new planned economy. And it was not only leftists who were fascinated. Conservatives and bourgeois intellectuals could also find something in the East. Academic Eastern European studies in Germany were most prominently advocated by the German right-wing MP, Member of Parliament and Professor of Eastern European History in Berlin, Otto Hötsch. The Nazis thought Hötsch was a pro-Bolshevik because of his sympathies with Russia, whereas he was a member of parliament for the German National People's Party, a right-wing party. And these intellectuals on the right wing were not shy to broaden their horizon in every direction. To give another example, Giselher Wirsing, mentioned already at the beginning with his Zwischeneuropa, was a right-wing nationalist too, yet unlike Hötsch, with an affinity for the Nazis. And Wirsing not only traveled through East Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the 1920s, but also to the USA in 1930, endowed with an Abraham Lincoln Fellowship. Fear and promise were omnipresent when looking to the West and to the East alike. Here in the USA, technical progress and mass consumerism, but a superficial culture. There in Russia, an ambitious project for the future that aroused admiration, albeit with enormous human costs and a violent regime. Between the rejection of a Western civilization, disparagingly called so, and the uncivilized East, which was allegedly longing for betterment in education, the understanding of Germany as the middle ground between East and West gained a certain plausibility. And so I come to the end. Of course, I overstate, I exaggerate my argument a bit, I emphasize it, but maybe you can see the point. I want to argue that the German self-image was determined by this middle position. This fact was for long not taken seriously by history and public discussion alike. Rather, the middle was understood as an ideological position of diehards and romantics. In order to understand the Weimar, I think we have to take the East-West equidistance more seriously. Given this, it is to emphasize that the German gaze was directed much more towards the East and Southeast than our view, shaped by the Cold War, takes into account. The gaze towards the East held for the cultural dimension as it was for business and industry, which wanted to make money wherever possible, okay. But above all, it applied to the ideas of good politics and a good form of government. Democracy, as Tim Müller and Adam Tooze have pointed out, is a history of asynchronicities and wide-ranging, multifaceted ideas. For Zwischeneuropa, the period after the First World War was an experimental phase for new political forms with few models, though. We should not forget, even the today celebrated examples of Great Britain and the USA were far from being mass democracies then, but rather ruled by elites, supported by an intellectual base that only slowly expanded over time. To give you one number, before the First World War, only 16% of the population in Britain were eligible to vote. In Germany, in contrast, the figure was already, at that time, 21%, about 20% more. The introduction of women's suffrage, which was carried out rapidly and incomprehensively in Germany in 1918, was rather slow in the older democracies, slower than in Germany. When we look to the commonalities of with the new states in Zwischeneuropa, two features stand out, I think. First, authoritarian rule as a reassurance, intended for times of crisis, but also for internal nation building. And secondly, a longing for similarity, for a homogeneity of people, nation, and state, with a certain disgust for pluralism and a complicated relationship with a political opponent. These concepts were also this opponent who was rather seen as an enemy. These concepts were also viewed with sympathy in Germany, precisely because here the trauma of inner discord had become a negative myth with a long history. With a look to the East, Germany was not an exception or a case of failure. Rather, it was more democratic and it withstood the road to dictatorship longer than most other countries of Zwischeneuropa. This scholarly embedding of Weimar in an essentially Eastern Europe context is still in its beginning. For example, we know very little about the German perception of the Eastern experiments with democracy so far. We do not know how Pilsudski and Masaryk, how Horthy and the Southeast European royal dictatorships, but also how the Baltic new states in their attempts were observed and seen as possible example or comparable in Germany. We know a lot better about the relationship with France, Britain, and the USA. Much of this imbalance, I think, can be explained by Cold War mentalities, also among historians, when the normative Western concept of a liberal democracy became a term for democracy as such. We may think so, and rightly so, but this may have not been the case with the discussion in interwar times, when this was a term that had to be experienced and tried out. The position of Germany in the middle, however, did not necessarily lead to more balance or reconciliation. The European cultures of hostility rather pushed for demarcation, and so did the German attitude. Their view towards Eastern and Southeastern Europe was constantly guided, and we should not forget about this, by a pronounced sense of superiority. The view to the West, on the other hand, was determined by a feeling of disadvantage, but perhaps also by inferiority. Both perspectives were ambivalent, and I believe that when we reflect on the burden of the Weimar Republic, we must take this ambivalence more into account. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Thomas, for this lecture. It's very thought-provoking, very wide-reaching. I recall that when I first heard you talk, that must have been in 1995 or thereabouts, when you came to a seminar at Göttingen University to introduce your research about the Catholic bourgeoisie, if I recall correctly, in rather anti-bourgeois attire at the time. And I'm very glad that you have lost none of your knack for taking up quite crucial and, in a sense, reasonably established topics, but giving them not only a new twist, but even a new direction. And at the time, it was the upper middle classes, but the Catholics, not the Protestants, as one would expect. And later, the Weimar Republic, but not as a story of failure, but as a tale of democratic potentials, if often unrealized. And that's become now almost a mainstream interpretation, but it's fair to say that you pioneered it in your monograph on parliamentary culture. And now Weimar in transnational perspective, often talked about, often also researched under that angle, but focusing not on Western Europe, not on the relationship with the United States, not on Germany as a post-colonial nation, which is now often done, but on Eastern, East Central, Southeastern Europe. And yeah, as you also explained, to kind of talk about this central position of Germany within Europe as a historian, that has often been a bit suspect in the past, because there's this long legacy of talking of Mitteleuropa in an imperial sense, with meaning a Mitteleuropa dominated by Germany. And there's also been a tradition of talking about the Mittellage as if it were some kind of fate, and the criticism directed at that was that's essentially German responsibility, of course, for the Third Reich, was clouded in sort of a vague musings about Schicksal der Mittellage, the fate of being in the middle of Europe. And I think the way you approach this is eminently plausible with your concept of Zwischeneuropa, taking this part of Europe as a vast zone of crisis. You mentioned hyperinflation, for instance, but also a zone of opportunity and exciting potentials, economic potentials, cultural relations, political experimentation, military cooperation. And I think that's quite apt, because democracy in Western Europe, you could say there were these desires for radical renewal. There were also desires for authoritarian leadership. But then again, there was a stability of existing political systems, sometimes a sheer inertia of political systems. It's very hard to change a system like British or Dutch parliamentary democracy or the French Third Republic. Tons of people wanted it, they even tried, but they never really quite succeeded, certainly not before the Second World War. And at the same time, these systems also had a certain flexibility to accommodate, for instance, the desire for more authoritarian leadership, but without actually, by stretching the boundaries of democracy, but without overhauling the entire system. Hendrik Colijn, several times prime minister in the Netherlands, is a favorite example of mine. But in Eastern Europe, you rightly pointed out, every opposition quickly turned into an anti-system opposition, because the systems themselves were not established, were still in flux, and in flux was also the very meaning of democracy, the boundary between what's still democracy, what's already a dictatorship, or isn't even the dictatorship more democratic, Mazarik's point, than parliamentary democracy. And in that sense, it's quite plausible to say Germany was part of this broader context. And then you made all these specific points. Economists and intellectuals, and not just communist intellectuals, that's what you would expect, looked to the Soviet Union with revulsion sometimes, but also with fascination. And also your point that whether or not there was a similar interest in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary is a little hard to tell, just because we don't have that much research on it. So we don't quite know, is it just because fewer historians have really looked at this, or was there less interest in Poland, objectively in a sense, less interest in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia? And there's been quite an investment. It's called the investment in researching German-American relations, for instance, or usually generously funded German-French relations. Every groupuscule that had something to do with German-French cultural relations has been turned upside down in a way. And maybe we've just not had the same kind of research. There's research, and I think you quoted that, on the business interest in Southeastern Europe. We could also mention German Jews, among whom there was much more of an interest in Eastern Jewry, certainly by those with a Zionist inclination. And yes, so I thought there's plenty that's stimulating, and that also is simply insufficiently researched. Maybe two questions to put to you, to round it off here a bit. So there's a broader tendency of transnationalizing, indeed even globalizing, German history, but also Weimar Germany more specifically. And I'd just like to ask you, there's also there's been the focus on the West, but there's also been an engagement with Germany and Italy, the fascination with Mussolini in Italy, which was not actually just a fascist fascination. Even surprisingly liberal, we find surprising instances of quite liberal people who have a genuine curiosity about Mussolini and write quite positive things about him. How does that fit into this also, view towards the South? And then there's all this emphasis on Germany as a post-colonial country, a country that had its fair amount of colonial nostalgics, of even revisionists who wanted to turn the clock back, at some point regain these lost colonies in Africa. And then again, you have anti-colonialists in Berlin, not so much anti-German colonialists, because that was a moot point after 1918, but anti-colonialists against French colonialism, because they were safer, or British colonialism, because they were safer in Berlin than they would have been in Paris or London. So the question would be, what's the overarching, can we arrive at a synthesis, or are we in a situation where we kind of keep adding evidence of this relation, that influence, Poland, Africa, America, but we only have, in a sense, a piling up of different instances of these relations? Is there a conceptual, how could we synthesize all that? Or is that a good ambition to have? Second point would be that, maybe to throw back some of your own research at you, because Weimar had a chance of stabilizing. If you look at Weimar Germany from the vantage point not of 1918, not of 1933, but 27, 28, that it actually, when the Nazis had, 2.6% of the votes, then you could say at that point it looked quite differently from Pilsudski's Poland, from Horthy's Hungary, or even Austria, more liberal than Austria under a very conservative Catholic Chancellor, Ignaz Seipel. So would you say, is there a brief moment of westernization, just it's very brief, and it's in a sense then there's the opposite tendency again, or is it, as you kind of emphasized, pointing at the secret military collaboration with the Soviet Union, it's kind of an underlying structure that's independent of political conjuncture, that's even ongoing at a time when the government under Foreign Minister Stresemann looked more toward the West. So how would you assess this kind of aspect of time and shifts that may or may not have been important? Is the East always important? Was the East always as important, or was it more important, less important, then more important again, perhaps, towards the end of the Weimar Republic? So in any case, lots of food for thought, and yes, let's have a conversation about this. Thank you.
Yes, great. Also, thank you so much, Moritz, for your comments. I put straight forward to you, Thomas, to take up these both larger questions, actually. So the question of other regional or geographical perspectives than the East alone. That's the first complex, I guess. And the second one is putting in again the factor of time or chronology. What happens when we're going to stand into the year of 1927, for example? What does it mean for your story of East and West?
Yeah. Well, as you have noticed, I mostly understand of notions of democracy, of expectations, of imaginations of how it could be. That's why the post-colonial question is not so important in this respect for me. But you are completely right. What considers Italy? I would, from my point, I would do Italy much more to this Zwischeneuropa, because they were, in the first case, victors, but vanquished too, and they understood themselves as having lost the war. The Vittoria Mutilata is sort of an important point, and in many respects Italy resembles much more what happens in Southeast or East Central Europe. For this I would say, okay, there is a thing. You cannot say this belongs to this part and that belongs to that part, but what you can see is you find things like hegemony of ideas, or ideas that sound plausible, and this idea of, I say, authority as sort of a reassurance, which is completely absent in Britain, is a point which is very important in Germany. What I would say for the post-colonial thing, today it is researched quite intensely, and every second young doctoral students want to do something about post-colonial. I find it considerably overestimated, and I would say most people in Germany after 1918 did not think too much about the lost colonies, but much more about the lost value of the money and many other things. But it is important in a way that we can, in this post-colonial question, see how much does Germany understand itself still as a great power, or still as playing the big concert with the other empires. And here we have these two tendencies. We have the colonial powers, above all France and Britain, and we have these imperial powers like Habsburg, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. And my feeling is that in many respects, many people, not all of them, think, okay, we could also look towards Eastern Europe. So I would say these two fields of, say, colonies are also they coexist, and in some way they are competition. What considers the westernization, that's similar. Of course, there are lots of people who understand the West as sort of a role model. But have in mind that the beginning of the Weimar Republic, with a Reichspräsident who issued Notverordnungen all the time, was Friedrich Ebert, the Social Democrat. So it was the Social Democrats who started with this idea of an authoritarian regime as a reassurance in times of crisis. We should not forget about this. And I would not so much say that there were times when they were more westernized or less, but of course, after 1923, new tendencies, new opening of horizons came to Germany, and many people also in the provinces saw that this was, say, a possibility, a possible lifestyle. So think about things that General Motors became owner of Opel, or that Coca-Cola started to produce in Germany, or stuff like this. And that even in smaller cities, jazz bands, mostly they just thought jazz band is when there's a drum in the game played. So there is this other impression, these other ideas, and I would not deny them. I would just say we have for long forgotten the Eastern orientation, and that's what I wanted to emphasize today.
Yeah, very clear. Okay, thank you so much. I really would like to open a discussion to all of you here. I mean, we have been talking long in front, so if there are any questions, please raise your hand and I come over with a microphone. And the first one is here, Nathalie Scholz.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's an immense complexity that you presented to us. But for me, I mean, I'm very confused, I have to say. I'm confused by what the concepts of East and West really mean, or what you want them to mean in your analysis, and especially because at the end of the talk, it became more and more, I had the impression that it's really about a subjective perspective. So what do Germans, how did Germans use these categories to think about themselves, to think about the position, to think about certain aspects? And, I'm very sympathetic with the introduction of, we have we're still somehow influenced by a Cold War framework, and we should kind of leave that behind. But at the same time, in spite of some of the comments you made at the end, in my perception, you still used that framework. So, for example, I mean, when you say, and this is not about colonialism per se, but you use colonial gaze when it comes to, how Germany relates to Greece and, and what kind of ideas came up there. But you don't use that when you talk about a West that seems to be Britain, France, and the US exclusively also. So I don't quite understand. I mean, you use black jazz musicians as a sign of Western modernity, but you don't talk about segregation and the loss of segregations that inspired some Nazis. So I don't quite know. So I don't quite understand actually what is it precisely. How do you want to use these categories in your research?
Well, I'm very sorry for that. Of course, I talk about imaginations, and of course you are right. Your question is of a kind, we say, of course. Of course you're right when you say there was segregation. Most Germans, for example, had very mixed feelings about jazz musicians. On the one hand, they were excited by this kind of music. On the other hand, most Germans had a problem with blacks doing this game. What I was talking about was, first of all, the imagination of the historians who had analyzed Weimar. And they had a very strong idea of Western liberal democracy in mind. In a second step, or on a second level, I tried to understand that this kind of Western liberal democracy, which was chimera in many respects, was important for the Weimars, but not only as a positive role model, but also as, we do not want to have this so much. Of course, these are imaginations. But what I was talking very much about liberal democracy, about political mentalities, let's say so. And in conjunction to that, the idea of what is a good society, how does it look like? And there, my sole plaidoyer was to say, look more towards the East.
Okay, so we go on here. We have Hanko here.
Yeah, you say to look more towards the East. I would immediately associate your title, Weimar between East and West, to Thomas Mann's Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen, perhaps also to the lure of the East, of Russian literature, for example, which is much more close to the German literature, but also to Hermann Hesse, who is fascinated by India, for example, or Hermann Graf Kaiserling. And I was just thinking, how could we bridge these kind of concepts of the East to your concept in your talk? In that sense, that I would think political culture and cultural history could be bridged in a way, and I was not that disappointed, I must say. I really liked your talk, but it sounded to me as a more traditional political history. I've been at your talk about politicians in Badehose, which was much more provocative, to me at least.
Well, it depends on who listens. I would say that in the Weimar discussion, this question is still disputed because the idea that Weimar should have had the fate to develop like France, Britain, or so is still very much on the bottom of many of our assumptions. So, and I wanted to sort of scratch out some of these assumptions. By the way, the idea of this subject came to me when I talked to a student for a long time who said, well, we always talk about nation-states that are Western and the empires that are Eastern. But in many respects, Germany is an empire, at least until 1918. And why don't we sort of take that and say, well, there is much more into the empire idea, and there's a distinction towards Britain and France. And this was the implicit role model always. And I would say it's very ambiguous, one of my favorite words. It's cultural modernity, like, say, Eisenstein. Eisenstein is overestimated, but okay. But the way Mann or Hesse write, or the fascination from Russian literature, this is the same basic idea. They say, in many ways, we are much more like the Eastern literature. I just read Josef Roth's novels, and he, a Galician Jew who came to Germany and became an important commentator for newspapers, an important influential intellectual, and he has a kind of writing that is completely free of those American influences. So he writes a little bit like, so this is part of this kind of imagination, fascination, or the idea of belonging to. Yeah? So I try to sort of do hands and forth between the imaginations and sort of real political developments. And you are completely right, this is not so much cultural history, but part of cultural history is also always to reassess what frames are we using. So what are we referring to? What do we take for granted? And a lot of what is taken for granted, I have tried to put into question in this talk.
Yes, thank you. There was a question over here.
Thank you very much. It's indeed food for thought. I'm not a learned historian. I'm not more interested in politics. And when I hear your perspectives and your analysis, I'm curious, how do you look with these new insights to the unification of West and Eastern Germany? Because I think that was a big victor of the capitalism and the neoliberal and the liberal democracy. And in fact, it was also a clash between East and Western thinking. So I'm thinking loudly now and asking myself, is there gives your insights another perspective to analyze the impact of the unification in Germany?
Thank you.
Well, actually, your contribution has in the background the idea that the Iron Curtain was justified, because there was this Eastern orientation, and in the West the liberal idea prevailed, and actually many historians think so, and say, of course, in the Rhineland there have been the French, they had these old connections, and they always were more or less Western Europe, whereas Eastern Albia, Prussia, always was much more towards Russia. my own mentor, Hans-Ulrich Wehler, he talked about the East European Steppe when they when he came to Brandenburg. Actually, I'm not so sure about this, and I find it hard to answer because when Germany was unified in 1919, there was a long time of, call it re-education, call it cultural reorientation, call it whatever. And I would not underrate these more, well, it's not short-term, 50 years are not short-term influences to Western Germany and Eastern Germany. I guess most of what we have today is not the legacy of a long history that may be dating back to, say, Luther or at least Bismarck, but is much more short-term induced.
Mm-hmm. I see two more questions. I have one myself, a small one, to insert at rightly this point. Your reference to Hans-Ulrich Wehler is not very fair when he talked about the Brandenburgische Steppe, because he always talks about his own area around Bielefeld as the Ostwestfälische Steppe.
Correct.
And probably when he would have been in Amsterdam or somewhere else, he would call it a steppe. That was his usual talk. But the question to put forward here is, when the historiographical part of your undertaking is right, namely to say we are used to a Cold War view on Weimar informed by a kind of Western idea of what democracy is or should be, and that is a bias, would it in turn not be very fruitful for you to read more from the historiography from the eastern part of the Cold War conflict than you probably do? Why don't you read East German historians or even Russians on the history of Weimar to, as you say, scratch out the Eastern view? Would that be useful for you?
One has to read East German historians, but they are, of course, induced by Cold War perspectives as well. Huh? Sure. They have another setting. They say capitalism versus socialism. So this is equally a certain frame. But of course, in the wake of this idea of the socialist brotherships, there was a lot more research on relations between different East European countries. And you are right, one could take this again and have a look on it.
Okay, but that was just a smart remark. I think a short remark. We have two more, and those probably are the last. No, three. Those are the last, and I might combine them as the remarks. First, you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the lecture about the new gazes from the Weimar Republic. I have a question about the relation politics and aesthetics. You could say that the Social Democrats were in the lead a lot of time. In these years, could you say that there is an eruption of aesthetic new developments like Bauhaus, Blaue Reiter, and so more, which has been very much transnationalizing the art in Western and all over the world, you could say. One of the factors is, of course, the new industry of concrete and about Bauhaus and steel. You can use it in another way than before. But could you say that the Social Democrats have been giving a kind of welfare state which gives money and time for these developments, or are there other factors who has been the cause or a factor of development in this aesthetic way?
This last assumption about welfare state and development of art is very heavy, very difficult. I would say for that time, it's not really functioning. It comes with the 60s or so. But what is completely right is that we have an exploding cultural avant-garde that tries new things, not only in Germany, but also everywhere in the world, or especially America, USA, also in France. And I would say that this new developments were experiments, like the entire time was a time of experiments, and they were not necessarily politically clearly inclined. Just look at the futurists in Italy, or look at the ambiguous understanding of the Bauhaus architects be it West, be it East. So last of these architects, of these avant-garde architects, went to Russia. But I would say it comes into my picture of this is a time of experiment, and we should take this seriously. And all these artistic arts avant-garde developments are part of it. I would say yes. Yeah. Also print and others. No? So new techniques, new technologies, not concrete you said, but printing technologies, color printing technologies, for example, are as important also, by the way, for political campaigning. Those two.
Okay, thank you. We go to the last two questions, I think, here.
Thanks. Nicholas Baer from Utrecht University. Thank you for the talk. I had a question about the desire for homogeneity or similarity that you mentioned in the talk with regard to the Volksgemeinschaft concept. And I wonder, on a methodological level, how you're reflecting on this desire for similarity in your own analysis. Because I noticed in your talk moments when you, in a certain way, homogenized the German populace and talked about a German gaze onto the East, for example. And I wondered if you're thinking about moments of similarity versus differentiation in your own analysis, and to what extent you're kind of reproducing this desire for similarity or homogeneity in your own analysis of the period. And in particular, following the response by Fulmer, I was thinking of this book by Stephen Auschheim, Brothers and Strangers, about the German-Jewish relation to the Eastern European Jew during this period. And I was wondering if that might be an interesting moment of differentiation, given that German Jews had a different relationship to Eastern European Jews than maybe other members of the German populace more generally in the Weimar period.
The Volksgemeinschaft idea, and here I have been a student of Reinhard Koselleck, who developed the Begriffsgeschichte, and I would say Volksgemeinschaft is one of those multifaceted terms, concepts that are precisely usable because many use them in a different way. And you are completely right. This idea or this longing for homogeneity has always with it the question of who do I differ to then? Who is the other? So any other. And we can see that it's certain dimensions that are emphasized. So when the Catholics, for example, say Volksgemeinschaft and mean confessional conflict, they do not have so much of a problem with, say, left and right. But this is what they understand by it. And when Jews, bourgeois Jews, distinguish themselves from East European Jews, they want to be part of the German or bourgeois community. So, of course, this is, one could say, an ideological term. I just wanted to point to the fact that we only understand this in a racist context, and this is only part of the story. And I try to get one step more. When we talk about German bourgeois Jews, we have this very strong idea of who they belong, where they belong to. They belong to a German national community, and they are as anti-Semitic against the Eastern Jews, not against every Jew. So I'm not sure if I answered in a way that you expected it, but what is difficult about it is that this Volksgemeinschaft idea gains a lot of popularity in a time where the social differentiation of the German society takes on a real pace. So a new social layer comes up, the Angestellten, the clerks. We have new types of industrial production, partly coming in from the USA. We have a strong problem of the farmers, and we have the gender question, and we have the urban question. So this is a part where a new consumer society already exists. So we have a lot of what we call asynchronicities, Ungleichzeitigkeiten, and these are part of this differentiation. And I would understand the Volksgemeinschaft concept as sort of a way to compensate for that also. To say, okay, we are very different, but we have something in common.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We have one last question, and then it's closed. So, Jochen, for you.
Thank you. You explained very convincingly how Weimar Germany was economically and politically more Eastern than we maybe have thought or are thinking. But culturally, wasn't the kind of comparison between the US and the Soviet Union the same for most European countries? They kind of like looking to the West and the East. And wasn't it probably the case that the more eastern you went, that the people looked more to the West culturally and were a bit afraid of their big aggressive neighbor? So in which way culturally could we see Weimar more Eastern than we think or thought until now?
Well, I think that questions of cultural identity are much harder to assess than, say, of economic structures. Because is Thomas Mann considered to be somehow a Western or Eastern or something? Or is this highly dependent on how he rates himself? I just mentioned this example of Josef Roth, which for me was very eye-opener. And we could say that culturally, when you come to agrarian areas in Germany, this is for a long time very far away from modern industrial society. We have in many respects a very strong urban countryside difference. This is, and you are right that East and West, or USA and Soviet Union, were role models and interesting examples for many, many intellectuals. But I would say many more for the intellectuals than for the others. And what I tried to explain was that the idea, this idea is more than just an intellectual idea. It's also the idea of many normal people. They say, oh, these Americans, they are very strange, if they only know them from the media and so. So I do not know how to assess the question rightly, because cultural belonging is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Very final word for you, Moritz. You raised your hand.
Yeah, just a quick addition. These established democracies often have their way of doing things. Classic example would be Britain in the interwar period, where they basically acknowledge, yes, there's some need for reform. We prepare to look to the continent a little bit, but we have our own way of doing things in the end. Thank you very much. France is more insecure because the Third Republic is so controversial. But in Germany, the natural way of things, that's the way, not natural, but the way contemporaries often perceived it, was the Kaiserreich. And you could be against the Kaiser, you could make fun of the Kaiser, but he was always there, and then he was gone. Sort of gone to House Dawn in the Netherlands. And then there's a huge sort of desire for reorientation, also need for reorientation. And in just these are only 14 years, and with several major shifts within these 14 years, they constantly should we embrace American, should we allow American influences, American capital, American culture, should we even embrace that, or should we reject it? Lots of people thought we need a German way of doing things, but we don't quite know what it is. So there's a hectic look to the Soviet Union, to Italy, to Mussolini, into all directions, and no real consensus. And I think this Volksgemeinschaft also is a response to internal differentiation of society, but also a response of finally finding the formula that somehow keeps it all together, that somehow sees the dynamism, but also the stability, the mythical origins in some, Germanic tribes that in that shape or form never really existed, but also 20th century modernity, neo-imperial ambitions. So I think it's a sort of, and with some contemporaries, there's even a certain relief that in 1933, finally decisions are made. Finally, there's a direction, even if they initially don't agree with it. There's often a tendency to go along because also, at some point, there's all this controversy and this permanent kind of seeking, looking around, debating influences. It's fascinating for us, the historians, but it's also been quite stressful for the contemporaries in some way.
And that brings the story back to 1933 again, what we were not set out to do so today. So thank you very much. We're going to finalize discussion. Thank you for your talk, Thomas. Thank you all for being here. Get home well, and we meet again somewhere here at SPUI at some next lecture. Thank you, everybody.